Hey everyone! Today I have some pretty big news coming out of Kansas. The Kansas Attorney General, Chris Kobach, has just filed a lawsuit against Pfizer, alleging that the company misrepresented the safety and efficacy of its COVID-19 vaccine. The Republican AG made a statement that Pfizer made multiple misleading statements to deceive the public about its vaccine at a time when Americans needed the truth. 1 month ago, I would have expected this to go the way of so many cases stuck in a controlled justice system, but I now have hope that justice will finally be served for the many people who were harmed by these vaccines. Send your energy out there to manifest a difference in all aspects of our world. This lawsuit is making quite a splash because it accuses Pfizer of some serious stuff. According to the lawsuit, Pfizer allegedly concealed important information about adverse events and the waning effectiveness of the vaccine. We're talking about risks to pregnant women, potential links to myocarditis, pericarditis, strokes, and even death. The Kansas AG claims that Pfizer violated the state's Consumer Protection Act and is seeking civil penalties and unspecified damages. Now the question is, will the people benefit by the civil penalties and unspecified damages? This would be a sign that compensation is coming in various ways. In any event, it will set an amazing precedent for further civil litigation against Big Pharma. We are going to examine this action and how it can change our future. We are also going to examine how such precedent could extend even further into enhanced liability for other drugs by showing a pattern of deception and potentially even malice. This could get interesting, guys, but it doesn't stop there. The lawsuit also alleges that Pfizer was involved in censoring criticism on social media through various campaigns and partnerships. This, too, could be a huge precedent and could open up a can of worms. One thing I learned as an investigator was that one case that I investigated provided evidence to numerous other targets. Also, once they get to the records of the companies that suppressed it, that will lead to many other people who influenced social media providers to suppress free speech about them. Who knows? Maybe they could even be bought by celebrities or other connected people with enough influence to suppress dirt about them. I, for one, can certainly attest to that, especially if it means having your page abruptly taken down for giving my professional opinion on it. This is going to begin to get interesting. I predict a huge influx of lawsuits for civil damages in many areas. I hope that lawyers aren't going to bilk the people and that there is some sort of worldwide retribution made, which some have predicted. Because in short time, we could see these companies crumbling and going bankrupt. Maybe governments should go after them for damages to all the people of the United States and other countries. I know that many of you formed the hopes that you would wake up one day. The military will march in and everything would be fixed. From what I've been seeing, that notion is over-optimistic. Not that there won't be amazing changes in everything that we have imagined, but there must be a process that assures fairness. Such a move would not only be perceived as wrong, but it would be a totalitarian government, and that's not what we want. I still believe there's a high potential for the days of darkness, but nobody is waving a wand. Our society must evolve, and this will be a process. The good thing is that it's entirely up to us how quickly that happens. So let's understand how this process can likely go, which would retain our system of democracy. The Attorney General's office had previously tried to get their hands on some confidential documents and internal communications from Pfizer, accusing them of violating past consent judgments. If it is proven that Pfizer violated past consent judgments, this could have numerous significant effects on the penalties for future cases as a pattern of behavior is established. We will address them shortly. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen something like this. Just last year, the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, filed a similar complaint against Pfizer. That lawsuit also accused the company of misrepresenting the effectiveness of the vaccine and suppressing public discourse. The case is pending. It will be discussed further, and there will be links to both complaints in the description for your review. It looks like the scrutiny and controversy surrounding COVID-19 vaccines and the companies that produce them are only growing. Pfizer, of course, denies all these allegations in the strongest possible terms. They argue that the data shows a higher risk of myocarditis after contracting COVID-19 compared to the risk after vaccination. So basically, they are saying that the virus caused the myocarditis, not vaccine. Pfizer maintains that its vaccine has been rigorously tested and proven safe and effective. I've seen the studies, and as an ex-drug regulator, I can tell you that they are insufficient to warrant widespread distribution. Interestingly, Pfizer has also requested that the Texas lawsuit be moved to federal court, arguing that its work on the vaccine was on behalf of the federal government. Did you hear that, guys? Pfizer is alleging that they were being paid by the United States government. We are going to look a little further into this agreement and see who actually signed it. So let's get started. As mentioned, Pfizer's defense is to blame everybody else. It wasn't them, it was the virus. It wasn't them, it was the U.S. government. They will have to provide some serious data that it was the virus that caused the myocarditis and not their vaccine. I don't think they can do it, and if they can prove that the virus did it, there is definitely going to be shared liability. In fact, I think this one has shared liability for many powerful structures. And don't think for 1 second that the mask mandates didn't create significant culpability in this. I'll link a video about the masks and the pneumonia caused by long-term use. The U.S. government, the Center for Disease Control, CDC, the World Health Organization, WHO, politicians, business owners, and government organizations who fired people. All of these individuals could have liability for this, as it should be. So how did the government hire Pfizer? Pfizer's argument that its work on the COVID-19 vaccine was done on behalf of the U.S. federal government stems from the government's role in funding and overseeing the vaccine development through several key initiatives. Here's how that relationship works. 1. Operation Warp Speed. U.S. government funding. Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine development was supported by Operation Warp Speed, OWS, a U.S. government program initiated under the Trump administration to accelerate the development, manufacturing, and distribution of vaccines for COVID-19. This should be addressed because Donald Trump did not sign the contracts for the COVID-19 vaccine agreements under Operation Warp Speed. The contracts with companies like Pfizer were signed by officials within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, and other relevant agencies, such as Moncef Slaoui, Chief Scientific Advisor for Operation Warp Speed, and Dr. Robert Kadlec, Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. Kadlec is an expert on biological weapons and has been associated with allegations of exerting pressure related to COVID-19 vaccine development by government whistleblowers. Trump established Operation Warp Speed, OWS, which was launched in May 2020. He provided the executive backing, public messaging, and political support for the program, which included securing funding and resources for vaccine development. He also played a part in encouraging partnerships between the U.S. government and pharmaceutical companies. But the technical and legal details of the contracts, including who signed them, were handled by the designated government officials, not Trump directly. To me, this means that he delegated this responsibility to dark people who had infiltrated his organization. Any large organization cannot succeed without delegating responsibility for a number of reasons. Clearly, there are too many tasks and decisions to be handled by a single individual. Different tasks require different skill sets. For instance, a person with a background in business must rely on medical experts in the areas of medicine. As operations grow, it becomes impossible for one person to oversee everything. This is why reducing the size of government is beneficial to proper oversight. Delegation allows the president or person in charge to focus on the broader vision, strategy, and oversight, while others handle the day-to-day tasks. Perhaps it was too early for his presidency because the head of the snake wasn't cut off until 2021. Or maybe his presidency was a means of flushing out and getting to the snake. All I know is that now we have a fresh new start. It looks like we could have Elon Musk overseeing the influx of advanced technologies, and Robert F. Kennedy transitioning us from reliance on big pharma to energy, medicine, and natural health. Let's look a little further at why Pfizer appears to be dumping liability for the COVID vaccine on the government. Under the contract, Pfizer receives substantial government funding for the vaccine's research and development. There are about 272 million individuals aged 16 and over in the United States as of July 1st, 2023. Under multiple agreements between Pfizer, the U.S. government gave the company just under $4 billion for 200 million doses. However, the United States did not directly pay for research and development or production. The contract is merely an agreement to purchase the drug. This makes me think that Pfizer is going to have a good time pinning their liability on the U.S. government. That doesn't mean that the government doesn't have negligence or other liability. I think they are both liable with numerous officials and agencies who purchased the drugs, but it gets better. The U.S. government did, however, fund the research, development, and production of Moderna's vaccine, as well as another 200 million doses. That is 400 million doses were bought for 272 million people over 16. This is where I can see that Moderna could launch a defense of joint liability. The fact is that myocarditis has also been reported with the Pfizer vaccine, though at a lower rate than Moderna in younger people. If you know anyone that is still taking the COVID-19 vaccine, you might want to share this chart or information with them so they can choose one over the other based on risk. Let's look at additional potential liability. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, granted Pfizer's Vaccine Emergency Use Authorization, EUA, in December 2020. This process should have involved close cooperation with the government to assure that Pfizer's clinical trials, safety protocols, and final approval were in line with government standards. Did FDA adequately screen the clinical trials before issuing this emergency use authorization? The EUA loophole allowed them to distribute millions of doses of a drug that did not have adequate research and validation. If I were an attorney, I'd probably explore whether the vaccine was truly eligible for emergency authorization. The U.S. government also played a significant role in the distribution of the vaccine, including logistical support through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. The government also facilitated the vaccine's distribution to states and local jurisdictions, ensuring it reached healthcare facilities and individuals. Here's the problem. Under the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, PrEP Act, companies like Pfizer that developed vaccines during a public health emergency were granted legal immunity for any adverse effects or side effects resulting from the vaccine, as long as they followed regulatory guidelines. The PrEP Act, Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, was signed into law in 2005 by President George W. Bush, providing legal immunity to companies and individuals involved in the development and distribution of medical countermeasures during public health emergencies. So, where do victims lie here? Apparently, the attorneys suing Pfizer must feel that they can pierce this protection with proof that they did not follow guidelines or had other negligence or malice. This was an additional layer of government involvement, as our lawmakers shielded vaccine manufacturers from lawsuits related to their vaccines' use during the pandemic. Given the involvement of the U.S. government in the vaccine's distribution, Pfizer could argue that its role in the creation and distribution of the vaccine was done in line with government directives and goals. The company might argue that it followed the government's instructions, especially with respect to public health objectives, and that any misrepresentation of the vaccine's efficacy would be a matter of miscommunication or oversight, rather than intentional fraud. In essence, Pfizer is arguing that its actions were part of a broader public health initiative driven by the federal government, and therefore, it was acting in accordance with the government's wishes and under its protective legal framework. Now let's look at the implications. If a defendant has violated previous consent orders, it can significantly impact a lawsuit in various ways, depending on the nature and jurisdiction of the case. Consent orders are legally binding agreements approved by a court, and violating them can suggest a pattern of noncompliance. Here's how such violations might affect a lawsuit. The defendant's prior violations can demonstrate a lack of credibility or disregard for legal obligations, which could influence the judge's or jury's perception of the defendant's character. Violations of previous orders can be presented as evidence of a pattern of noncompliance, supporting the plaintiff's claims about the defendant's conduct or intentions. This is particularly relevant in cases like contract disputes, family law, or restraining order violations, where intent and behavior patterns may weigh heavily. Courts may view the defendant's repeated violations as aggravating factors, potentially leading to harsher penalties, fines, or additional damages. For example, if the lawsuit involves ongoing harm or financial loss, prior violations may result in increased compensatory or punitive damages. Violating a consent order is considered contempt of court. The court may impose sanctions such as fines, imprisonment, or further legal restrictions on the defendant to ensure compliance with any new orders that may be issued. A defendant's history of violating consent orders might make the plaintiff less willing to agree to settlement terms or, conversely, demand stricter terms in any agreement. If settlement negotiations are affected, a court may impose supervision, requiring the defendant to meet specific conditions or face immediate consequences if they fail to comply. Courts may issue more stringent or detailed injunctions if previous orders were violated. This might include increased monitoring, mandatory reporting requirements, or restrictions on certain activities. In cases like business litigation, the court might take preventive measures to protect the plaintiff's rights or interests due to the risk posed by the defendant's past violations. If the violations are severe and clearly documented, the court may grant summary judgment in favor of the plaintiff, ruling that there is no need for a trial due to the defendant's clear noncompliance. Judges often have discretion to rule on certain procedural matters, and a history of violations could lead to unfavorable decisions on evidence admissibility, deadlines, or procedural requests for the defendant. Overall, violations of previous consent orders can add significant weight to a plaintiff's case and often result in stricter enforcement, harsher penalties, and decreased chances of favorable outcomes for the defendant. This lawsuit could be the start of justice and its remedies to compensate the people of the world. A little suit in Kansas could literally impact the world as governments are scrambling for ways to execute the plan of salvation in their countries. Some of you will understand this and some won't, but everyone should remember it. Where we go one, we go all. That means that whatever happens in this plan forward, the world is in it together. There won't be change in one part of the world and not another. This historic event is larger than most understand. This is the coming of a new age. It's akin to the fall of the Roman Empire or the Black Plague epidemic and the emergent Renaissance periods that followed. Only this time it's on a worldwide scale. These times are both epic and biblical. I'm excited to release my next video with some planned changes that demonstrates how the world is going to heal and how quickly it could go. I want you to know that we are living in amazing times. All of us. Because where we go one, we go all. To every one of our brothers and sisters in every corner of the world, we will soon be united.